So I thought it was a chimed in and said, well, that's a very anthropocentric, human-centric definition of ecosystem services. And I said, yes, it is. That's what it is about. It's ecosystem services are that connection to humans. And if you don't have humans in the definition, it is not ecosystem services. But what we're trying to do here is and this is what I keep talking about, is decisions are incomplete and inefficient if they don't include all benefits and costs. And so we want to try to measure the benefits from the natural environment as anybody that might be putting in Ken Heck and I were talking about this yesterday, anybody that might be want to put in a marina, okay? There's benefits that they're going to talk about, right? Employment, taxes, et cetera. Why can't we talk in the same vein about the benefits of not putting in that marina and keeping that marsh, mangrove, those oyster reefs intact? So it's the idea of playing on a level playing field. And so that's what motivates much of my work. So I never really do this, but I thought it appropriate for this presentation is to actually have an outline. So the things I want to talk about today is just a brief history of ecosystem services, provide a couple of examples from my own work, some that Juice has been involved with, U.S. policy on ecosystem services. So as Juice said, I did have the opportunity to serve as the chief economist for NOAA over the last year, and that provided a lot of opportunity to influence policy as well as work amongst the different management agencies to think about how we move out on ecosystem services. So I want to share with you some of the things that are coming down the road that could influence some of the work and maybe directions that you take. And just some final thoughts that I have about moving forward. So a brief history of ecosystem services. So in the modern era, not quite, but in 1997, we're all very familiar with this work by Bob Costanza and his group that, in nature, that valued ecosystem services worldwide, this huge range of 16 to 54 trillion dollars. There were lots of questions about the methodology, especially from the economics community. In fact, it was not very rigorous at all. This high value here, $54 trillion, was actually greater than the combined gross domestic product of the entire world, so things weren't matching up there. So it wasn't very strong on that side of things. Calculating this number wasn't very strong. But what it did do was in a very positive, what it did do was bring to light this idea of ecosystem services. Published in Nature, it brought it, to the forefront of people's mind and really started to kick things off. That same year, Gretchen Daly came out with this book called Nature's Services. And her idea wasn't to place a value on these ecosystem services, but what she wanted to argue was that we needed to have this very strong link between biophysical structure, function, and processes, and how it impacts human well-being. So her book was an attempt, sorry, I need to get more in the camera, I apologize. Her attempt to be able to describe what that link should look like and how we go about doing that. So those two things really kicked it off in the 90s. And then following that, in 2003, was this beginning of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. And it's been actually a series of projects that have come about that. It just wasn't a one and done. But in 2003, they really set up kind of the stage about how you would go forward thinking about incorporating biophysical structure and function processes and connecting that to human well-being. So this was a worldwide effort led by the UN as well as others, and kick-started this idea off in 1997. Papers by Costanza and book by Daly. Then came along in 2007, 2008, the TEEB effort, which is the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity. And this is mainly an effort by European countries. There are some Asian countries that are involved. U.S. is not involved with this at all. UN is involved. And it's just was a continuation off the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, where the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment was kind of providing principles and guidelines. The TEEB said, okay, great, now we actually need to begin to measure something. And so this is what the TEEB has, a series of projects where they're going about in various biophysical environments and starting to measure essentially ecosystem services. But I want to go back, actually, before 1997, because really where you start to begin to see some of the earliest work talking about ecosystem services were in the 60s. And these two papers here, Hellwell in 1969 and King in 1966, were trying to make this connections between, in this case, wildlife, and it was mainly recreational activities, so wildlife hunting, wildlife fishing, and nature, and what nature was providing us in terms of being able to take advantage of those opportunities. So this was done in the mid-60s, but even before that, H.T. Odom, when he was the lab director at the University of Texas Marine Science Institute, which it's called now, he was a lab director in the late 50s through the early 60s. He commissioned a report working with an economist at the business school at UT Austin to be able to measure the impact of some of the resources that were coming out of the Corpus Christi Bay area and be able to actually start to begin to put a dollar value on it. So while we kind of think in the modern era, back to 1997 might have been the starting point for ecosystem services, it actually goes further than that. And it actually, you could argue, started, at least in the United States, started on the Gulf Coast. So I think that's pretty interesting. So what does ecosystem services today in the Gulf of Mexico look like? So building off of all of that momentum from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment and TEEB and so forth, we had this thing called the Gulf of Mexico Alliance form. Many of you have heard about that. Many of the people in this room are involved with that. And the Action Plan 2 was very explicit in the Gulf of Mexico. This action plan was very explicit about beginning to incorporate ecosystem services in some of the work that was beginning to take place. And so, in my opinion, really, for the Gulf at least, what kicked off a lot of the work started because it was in this action plan too. And why that was important was because the federal agencies were now going to start putting money behind moving out and starting to do studies on ecosystem services in the Gulf. So what happened was, based upon this action plan too that said, yes, go forth and begin to look at how to move out on ecosystem services, valuation, identification, quantification, evaluation. There was this small group that came together, Gulf of Mexico Collaboratory on Ecosystem Services, back in 2009, that said, okay, how do we begin to do this in the Gulf? We've never really had any direction about, what might be the relevant services for the Gulf, how we define them for ourselves. So, you know, what do you do at a workshop? Well, you plan another workshop. And so, but this time it was a bigger workshop. And so what we did was say, okay, we need to move forward. We need to, you know, beyond just the scientists here, we need to actually bring in other stakeholders, agencies, federal, as well as private sector. And so this first major ecosystem services workshop took place over in Bay St. Louis. There were probably 40 people over 2 days in that workshop, and it was really just to bring the community together to say, okay, what's important to us? What would we like to see funded first? What are some of the science gaps that exist? And of course, in any of these type of workshops, there's lots of dots. There's lots of sticky dots on posters on the side to help us vote on the most important things. And so we got quite a bit of work done there. So following that, there were opportunities that came out to be able to begin to fill in some of the gaps between the biophysical structure, function, and processes, and how those led to ecosystem services. Excuse me. So there is a lot of work that is taking place, a lot more work now that is taking place on ecosystem services in the Gulf. A lot of you are involved in that, especially on the biophysical side. I would say as in my role as an economist, in trying to identify, quantify, and value ecosystem services, in the spectrum of the work of ecosystem services from beginning to end, really the biophysical work that needs to be done probably makes up about 70% of that. And my job is kind of come in and do that value add. So I can't do my job if I do it right. I can't do my job very well at all without good, strong biophysical work to back that up. At least that's the way I think of it. So a couple of examples here. Let me start off with a cartoon. Many of you are aware of Sherman's Lagoon, Sherman being the shark there. So what's it say here? My bill? Your bill for what? Ecosystem services. Huh? What's that? Right? That bad term, ecosystem services. Crabs play a vital role in the environmental health of this planet. Yeah, so it's about time we started charging for it. Come on, get with it, Sherman. If you're not charging for ecosystem services, you're nobody. My ecosystem services? Yeah, what do you do besides sit there all day and there's a bubble coming up and make little methane bubbles? And he says renewable energy. So I think you've arrived when your discipline starts to be talked about in cartoons. I mean, that's really a way forward. Of course, we know Jim Toomey is very much connected to the marine and coastal environments, and so that's his passion. So one of the projects that we worked on a few years ago was this idea of the value of nutrient regulation by oyster reefs. And the collaborators in this were Jenny Pollack, Haichul Kim, and Paul Montagna. And this was not funded. This was based upon just data that we had collected. Jenny had collected with regards to filtration rates and denitrification rates and so forth with the oyster reefs. And then I came in with the value add is, okay, how can we begin to value that service? There's been a lot of work done about the decline of oyster reefs. Many of you are familiar with the Beck et al. Paper, Doug Lipton, and the work that he's done in the Chesapeake. But to truly value the services from oysters, there's been very little of that. There's been lots of conjecture about what that value is, but just digging in and drilling down and trying to get a nice solid value, at least for one service, very little of that had been done. So we wanted to begin to fill that gap. So we focus on this one service. And if you look at kind of the traditional 22 ecosystem services, and I'll talk about how that's changing in a little bit. If you look at a list of 22 traditional ecosystem services, nutrient regulation is one of those. So we wanted to hone in on that. So we wanted to focus on a process that was transferable. Our geographic area of focus here was kind of Copano Bay and Aransas Bay in the Gulf coastal bend of Texas. This is northeast of Corpus Christi Bay. But this is really important. Lots of oyster reefs, lots of commercial fishing in this area, lots of recreational fishing in this area around these reefs. So we consider nitrogen regulation as a function of denitrification, burial, and physical transport out of the system, so harvesting. So if you're taking shell out of the system, if you're taking oysters and shell out of the system, then that is part of that nutrient regulation, nitrogen regulation process. So now, I started off with this, this kind of this potential disconnect between our biophysical features, habitats, and constituents of well-being, and now we want to begin to connect those a little bit more. So the way, and this may be a little bit linear, but it helps me explain this to audiences and helps me wrap my head around it. So I look at the biophysical feature in oyster reef, and there's a biophysical functioning. In this case, filtering in 3D structure leads to ecological function. So what does it do more for the system? And then that leads to this idea of ecosystem services. And the one that we wanted to focus on, connecting that to human well-being, was this idea of the nutrient regulation, which we would expect to impact this idea of not clean air, potentially, but more clean water. Okay, what does it do for water quality? So this was Jenny and Paul's part of this. Brittany Blomberg is in the room, so she was in those labs. So if there are questions about filtration rates and so forth, maybe Britt can help answer those. She's a little, she says you're putting me on the spot. So this data was collected through 2007, 2008. In those locations, we calculated the filtration rates and the clearance rates. You can see those there. And what we wanted to get at was, what are the reefs doing for us that we don't have to do for ourselves, right? What are we avoiding in terms of potential engineering costs in the removal of those nutrients? So the approach that we use is what's called a cost equivalent approach. And basically we're saying, what is the service of that nitrogen removal that's being provided by the oyster reefs? And the way to do this is think about what would a tertiary treatment on a wastewater treatment plant cost. So in our case, we were looking at this biological nutrient removal system, so an add-on system. What would the engineering cost of that be, supplemental to a wastewater treatment plant? And this is a technique that's used quite often. You have to use it in a very focused way. There has to be a demand for that nutrient removal, and we saw the potential demand for the nutrient removal in the system. So what we found out that just within that small system, by applying that kind of cost equivalent approach, we found that it was almost $30,000 a year for that small system in terms of the nutrient removal service that it was providing. Now that doesn't sound like a lot, but remember that's one service, so it's a very conservative estimate of what that you could say the service value of that oyster reef would be. If you wanted to get a complete value of that oyster reef, you'd include things like recreational fishing opportunity, maybe shoreline stabilization, possibly carbon sequestration, maybe not, other services. So this one service within that system providing potentially $30,000 a year of an equivalent cost that would have to be engineered. There's been some studies that are close to this on the East Coast, so our numbers were not too far off from these same sorts of studies. So we feel pretty confident about the approach. But this is not a primary evaluation study. And what I mean by that is we did not go out and ask individuals within the community itself about what they would value the nutrient removal service that the oyster reefs provided. So that is, for us, the holy grail, to be able to do that with those primary evaluation studies. The problem is they're complicated, they're expensive, and a lot of times the funding is not there. Except, in the case in 2012, the Regional Sea Grant Consortium, along with NOAA's, at that time, Coastal Services Center, and the Gulf of Mexico EPA's Gulf of Mexico program, pulled together $1.3 million to do primary evaluation studies in the Gulf of Mexico region. They felt this was a gap that was missing. They wanted to fill that gap. So this is a large shot in the arm. I mean, I'm not aware of any other region actually in the United States that has dumped that amount of resources into primary evaluation of ecosystem services in any particular region. So this was huge. we were fortunate to win. There were 2 studies that were funded out that we led one of the studies. Juice was involved with that. They wanted to focus on marsh ecosystem services emanating from marsh, mangroves, and oyster reefs. I argued for seagrass. They said, well, maybe next time we'll get to that. So they just wanted to focus on marsh, mangroves, and I see some people shaking their head. Yeah, they should have focused on. I agree, but we'll get to that. We'll get to that hopefully in the future. So you can imagine they're not saying value ecosystem services in Mobile Bay, value ecosystem services in Galveston Bay. They're saying value the ecosystem services emanating from all these biophysical features for the whole Gulf of Mexico. Right? So a pretty large task. So how do you begin to get this done? What we used is called an attribute-based stated choice approach, and I'll delve into that in a little bit more in a moment. To calculate a monetary value, in this case, and I do want to back up for a moment. As an economist, I realize the inherent difficulty in calculating really good monetary values. It's really hard to do. I think there are other ways to connote value of ecosystem services, connote value from our natural environment. So when we go forward and try to do a monetary valuation, to do it right takes a lot of effort, and you got to be very, very careful. So how do I translate what I just said? Well, the translation of what this is that we ask a random sample of individuals across all Gulf states what they're willing to pay to protect coastal resources, right? And we lead them through a series of questions that help us elicit what they're willing to pay, and I'll show those in just a moment. So the process is we designed a survey instrument. In this case, it was, physically on paper, it was about 30 pages. It was about 30 questions. There's a lot of background information. So the biophysical work that was done ahead of time, which Jenny, Pollock, and Juice did, to help us make sure that we're just not picking things out of thin air, because that we need to make the scenarios as realistic as possible. So we're looking at changes in the habitats over the next 50 years. And so what would that look like? So we had to have a really good, strong grounding in the biophysical structure and function of processes. So once we have developed that survey instrument, what do? Well, you take it out and you conduct focus groups. We conducted 2 focus groups in D.C. because our partners were Resources for the Future. We conducted 2 focus groups in Texas, and we conducted actually a focus group here in Alabama to help us refine that survey instrument. Because now we're surveying humans. And what do we know about humans is that everybody has an opinion about things, and they're usually not necessarily the same. People ask me, about the social, behavioral, and economic sciences, and I'd say it's the harder sciences because we're dealing with humans, right? I mean, human opinion, can really take you off in different directions. And then we pre-test it. So as we're getting ready to put the survey in the field, we pre-test it with a part of the sample, part of the panel. So this is the heart of the survey here. And I don't expect you to be able to read this, but why we call this an attribute-based stated choice. So why is it stated? Because it's you stating an opinion about something. We're not observing your behavior. That would be a revealed preference. We see you doing something. What you're doing is you're stating about a particular opinion that you have. So how this is set up is that we have kind of the present conditions, the aerial extent of salt marshes, mangroves, and oyster reefs. And by the way, this was done separate survey in Texas, separate survey in Louisiana, survey for Mississippi and Alabama combined, and then a separate survey for Florida. And so we got all the relevant biophysical data. We kind of figured out, if no further action was taken in 2050, what might that look like? And then we see, decreases in all this aerial extent. And then we said, okay, here's some options. Here are some programs that if you were to fund, you might be able to reverse some of this change. And so we mix this up. There are several of these panels that they see, and there are several votes that they have to make. And so we mix it up with, one of these attributes is how much they're willing to pay. And then the other attributes is how much we change the change in the biophysical feature. And so they go through this series of these folks, and then when we take those results out, and then we put it through our econometric models to generate the willingness to pay numbers, which I'll share with you in just a moment. So how did this look? Number of respondents, over 1,200 for the total region. Florida 316, Alabama, Mississippi 318, Louisiana 297, Texas 343. How we actually got the sample was GFK is a commercial company that, this is what they do. They do surveying for academic institutions, for business mainly, and so they have individuals impaneled. So these are stratified random samples. So you hear about what the poll numbers are for different candidates right now across the country. Well, they're using small sample sizes throughout the country, but the stratified random sample, so they should be able to take that and be able to project that to the full population. We're using the same thing. It's a computerized survey, so one of the requirements is that everybody must have a computer. If you're impaneled, if you're on the panel and you don't have a computer, they actually provide a computer for you. And so these panels, you're on a panel for a couple of months and then you rotate off. So this is it's expensive. It's about $60 a survey is what it costs, but this is the best way to get the data. To try to do it on your own would be way too cumbersome. So some of the results that I want to share with you. Willingness to pay results. You can find maybe yourself. By the way, was anybody in here surveyed? Anybody remember that? Okay. Not likely that you would have been, but I'd just be curious. So one of the things that you'll notice, so we have here the different we have attributes of salt marsh, mangroves, and oyster grease. We did not survey for mangroves in the Alabama, Mississippi survey, and we did not do that in Louisiana. Not that they don't exist, but that the individuals within the state really don't know that they don't exist, right? I mean, there's some mangroves beginning. Ken and I were talking about this yesterday in Alabama. There's more in Louisiana, but salt marsh, that's what they understand in terms of wetlands. And so it didn't make sense when we worked through the focus groups to keep mangroves in those two regions. But I do want to focus on the all states combined and try to interpret what these values are. By the way, the way that what you were asked to do as a survey respondent was you were asked to pay into a program for 10 years, and how you would pay would be through your electric bill. We originally, this is the value of the focus group, we originally wanted them to pay through the water bill, but what we found out is there's a lot of people that don't get water bills, that they actually are on wells, so it made more sense to do electric. So how we interpret this value, this willing to pay per household, this is on a percent point change. So this 3.1 for all states combined for marsh, how you interpret that is if you want to prevent an additional 10% loss in marsh over the no further action scenario, that essentially the household would be willing to pay $31 per year. That's what the survey and the statistical analysis showed us. What really to me is, so that's nice. The reality is though, if we did that survey today, those numbers would change. Now why would those numbers change? If we did that same survey today versus 2 years ago, why would those values change? Well, people's preferences change. People's income change. What they see as potential change in the environment, information changes. Would it be different? Would it be close? Yeah, it would probably be close, but that value would change over time. But what's more of interest to me are all the questions that we ask, all the kind of attitudinal questions and perception questions, knowledge questions. So one of them was this awareness of state government and conservation efforts. So remember, this is a stratified random sample from your state. Overwhelming majority of the respondents said they were unaware of any programs that their state government or NGO conservation groups had, any effort. I think this underlies the need for more education, visitation, and location is also important. And that's, walking around here over the last day and seeing what this lab does in terms of bringing in students, I think is great. Unfortunately, we don't have that capability at the Hart Research Institute, but that's the beginning of that process. Also, this is very interesting. Willingness to pay as a function of distance from the coast. So remember, this was not just, these people weren't surveyed just along the coast, they were surveyed all over the state. So if you can imagine, in Texas, we were surveying people way up in the panhandle where you're close to Oklahoma about this. What I want to draw your attention to is Alabama and Mississippi, is that there really is no distance decay as you move away from the coast. Now, would anybody have any insight as to why that might be? We did some follow-up on that, and I do have some insight as to why that might be. I was just curious if anybody here might chime in on that. So why would somebody, up in Birmingham and Montgomery and stuff, why you wouldn't see any distance decay in terms of the amount that they would be willing to pay? They'd be willing to pay as much as anybody on the coast. Vacation. That was exactly it. That everybody has, even if they're way up the northern end of the state, they have that connection to coming down for a week or two or whatever it is to the Gulf Shores or Orange Beach. So, and that in our follow-up conversations, that's exactly what came out. Is that so? There is that strong connection, at least in Alabama, to the coast, which is encouraging. But all the other states saw this distance decay. And I was quite surprised actually by Florida, because Florida is an ocean state, is a coastal state. I mean, Texas views itself as a state with a coast. Florida views itself as a coastal state. So that was still surprising to see that distance decay. What are some of the things that drove willingness to pay? So why were you willing to separate yourself from your hard-earned money? Well, this is very encouraging, because I thought we were all pessimists, but we're actually thinking about the future. We're thinking about our kids and our grandkids. I mean, this was a very strong signal across the board in all of the states. So, when you're looking at your neighbor and you're thinking, well, maybe they're not thinking about maybe they're only thinking about themselves. Well, at least in this survey, we found that to not be the case. So one of the things that was really important is that we needed to take this information, and we did some other parts of this work. We needed to take, and it wasn't just enough to get publications out of it. Part of it, as being Sea Grant funded, is they wanted a connection to decision makers or the community. So what we created here was a story map that, in a more user-friendly way, would be able to communicate the results of this study. So this is if you're interested later on, this is at geckoview.org, GECO view.org. And what we were trying to do here is convey what these values might be. So rather than, we did keep the error bars in there. That was something that we had to negotiate on. But the idea was that maybe there's a different way to communicate how these values to different people. The story map is a great communication tool. Some of you probably have used that tool in the past. The key is not to pack too much in the story maps. We pack too much in this story map, and so we're going through the process of trying to unpack some of that information. So I'd like to take a few minutes and talk about U.S. policy on ecosystem services, because that has changed quite a bit over the last several years. So it really has gotten a kickstart with this current administration, with the Obama administration. They came in shortly after they took office, really wanted to move out on this significantly. So in 2011, the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology were commissioned to come up with a report about environmental capital, or natural capital, protecting society and the economy. And the idea here is that ecosystems matter, the economy matters, and they do not work independently of each other. And so we need to make that connection more explicit. So it also helped kick off a more holistic understanding of what resilience is. Resilience might have been thought about resilience of social services or resilience of business continuity, et cetera. This was saying now you need to think about resilience in ecological systems as affecting resilience in social systems. And it actually let the federal agencies know what might be coming down the road. So also in that same year, the new principles and requirements came out. So the principles and requirements are basically what drive decision making on federally funded water projects. So things such as dredging, restoration, etc., dam building or dam removal, etc. And these had not been changed, these principles and requirements had not been changed since 1983. So the White House saw the opportunity, because this is the responsibility of the White House to develop these principles and requirements, they saw the opportunity to significantly change those principles and requirements to include now ecosystem services. And it was very explicit in the requirements and then the guidelines that followed up after that, that as you're going through the decision-making process, Army Corps of Engineers, NOAA, DOI, you need to consider ecosystem services in the calculation of the benefits as well as the potential costs that if you do a project could potentially negatively impact the environment. Before that hadn't taken place. So that was a significant move forward. It was the White House saying, now you need to consider this. The problem was, shortly after that became effective, that Congress put a rider on a bill, and I can't remember which bill it was, that essentially exempted the Army Corps of Engineers from following this. So NOAA, DOI, the other relevant agencies, they still have to follow it. They still have to move out on it. But for the time being, unless that's changed very recently, the Army Corps is exempt from having to apply this. But maybe there's other ways to get at the Army Corps. There were two really big directives, and I think this would be very interesting for people in this room, that came out of the White House last year. This first one here was what we call the Coastal Green Infrastructure Ecosystem Services Research Agenda. And in fact, I had the opportunity to co-chair the committee that wrote up this research agenda for the White House. And it's very explicit. It's saying coastal green infrastructure, living shorelines is important. We see opportunity there, but there are research needs that need to be met. There's still significant gaps in understanding how coastal green infrastructure works, how it can be advanced, et cetera. This was a directive to all the resource agencies that engage in coastal green infrastructure, everything from HUD and FEMA to NOAA, Army Corps, DOI. And it ranged, the research needs range from everything from better understanding of biophysical structure, function, processes of CGI to actually how you begin to communicate the benefits. Right? And how it actually becomes very difficult, many of you in this room know this, it becomes more difficult to permit coastal green infrastructure projects, living shoreline projects, than it does gray infrastructure projects. So they wanted to start breaking down those barriers. There is some early wins in this. SAGE, which is the systems approach to geomorphic engineering. It's a kind of a collaboration of Army Corps, NOAA, Nature Conservancy. They are actually using this research agenda to guide some of the funding that they will be putting out over the next couple of years. So that's positive. And I know there's work being done in this lab around coastal green infrastructure, and I think that's pretty encouraging that you'd be able to fit into these opportunities that arise out of this. Also, in October of last year, the White House, OMB, CEQ, and CEA, Council of Economic Advisors, came out with a joint memorandum that said all agencies now must begin to incorporate ecosystem services in their decision-making process where it's appropriate. So it's gone one step beyond the principles and requirements and said, okay, federal water projects, that's fine, but now you need to be doing more, right, federal agencies. And why this is important is because it's the power of the purse. It's the Office of Management and Budget, which is the connection between the White House and the holding of the purse and the budgets of the agencies and the programs within the agencies that can move out on ecosystem services. This is now just the memo for direction. The actual guidelines of how this happens within the agencies will be coming out, is expected later this year. So why that's encouraging, I think, for those of us in our field, is because they're going to need people to do that work. Right? The capacity does not exist within the agencies to do this work. Right? The ecosystem, it just does not exist. So I think that's encouraging for those of us that have an interest in this area. And some final thoughts. The first one is, and I've been talking about this for over the last year, is that we need to put system back into, well, not back into, it was never really into, we need to put system into ecosystem services. All the examples that I've given up to this point has, the services have been connected to a particular habitat, particular biophysical feature, oysters, marsh, mangrove. But we know those don't work independently of each other, right? We know there's connections between those biophysical features. And so as we think about trade-offs that we might make in terms of restoration decisions, right? One of the things that we're going to see a lot of over the next 15 to 20 years is restoration projects done along the Gulf Coast. How will those restoration projects work with each other? I mean, I'm trying to find the analog of the death by 1,000 cuts. In this case, it would be 1,000 projects with no connectivity, right? That could achieve a lot more if they were thought about as working together in a system. This is difficult. I mean, it's been difficult enough to think about ecosystem services connected to a particular habitat. Now we're thinking about systems. But systems, people have thought about systems for a long time. That's nothing new on the ecological side, right? Ecosystems coming into ecology. There's been a whole evolution of that. But now we're thinking about how do we move that and begin to do that as on my side, social behavioral and economic sciences, how do you begin to value that? But I think this is where we need to go. This is where I would like to go. And the next thing is the need to communicate it. Whatever your it is. In my case, it's ecosystem services. In your case, it might be, nutrient regulation. Whatever that it is, it's no longer enough to just assume we're going to get, the publication and somebody's going to read the publication and, have that aha moment. Doing the science and doing the publications is important, but if you want to affect policy and you want to affect change, you need to be able to communicate whatever your it is. And so I strongly encourage you to take advantage of opportunities that might exist. Compass is a group that many of you have probably heard about that very explicitly tries to connect scientists with policymakers, get science into the policy arena. So Compass is a group based out of DC. They'll actually be having a lot of work in the Gulf over the next few years. So as you see this group Compass come along, maybe take advantage of those opportunities. And quite frankly, if we can explain it to our neighbors and our grandmothers, wow. like Juice was talking about when he was introducing me, talking his father asking him about seagrass and the value of that. And, my grandmother asked me when I was heading off to study economics, David, what's economics? And I was, I could explain, marginal cost, marginal rate. She's not going to understand that. So how do we communicate this in very understandable terms? First thing, don't use ecosystem services. Talk about the benefits of ecosystem services. We can talk about that here in this room. And that's all. Thank you. That's not me, by the way. That's my son. But I did get a similar picture like that yesterday over at the estuarium. So, questions, please, comments, observations.
So how exactly did you decide to pose the questions that you did in your survey, particularly when you were asking people how much money are you willing to pay for this to do for your ecosystem area? I know the way you phrase that question impact your answer a lot.
Right. So the question for those that might be, at the satellite campuses, the question is, how did we choose the questions in our survey? And we built upon previous experience. So we had colleagues at Resources for the Future in DC. They do a lot of this survey work. They had a very similar survey that they had done in North Carolina. So the first thing is, you take that's a starting point, and you modify it for our own particular needs. But that's the reason for the focus groups, right? So one of the things is that we found is that those dollar values that you saw down there that you would be voting on, when we first went into it, they were way too high. And what we're trying to do is develop a demand curve. So you want different values, different dollar values, and you want people selecting different dollar values along the way. And we were way too high to begin with. So the focus groups help us, kind of hone in on that. And then you do the pilot test to even refine it a little bit further. So it's a very iterative process. Yes?
I'm not an economist, but it seems...
You will be shortened.
It seems like it's a kind of a very binary way that you
So I'm glad you bring that question up. So the question was if, you know, the perception is that we look at it either the service is there or not, where from an ecological perspective, it's always there. And I'm kind of paraphrasing.
Not necessarily that, but you know, like an oyster that's stressed because maybe the water is not, or the water's too fresh or too salty, is going to have a different, you know, function versus an
Absolutely.
oyster that's running on all cylinders and loves to play with that.
Absolutely. So answering maybe the first part of that. Ecosystem services exist when there's a demand for it. There's always the potential for services. I can't remember who I was talking to about this yesterday. There's a county south of us in Corpus Christi called Kennedy County, huge ranching area. King Ranch, maybe some of you heard the King Ranch. There's other ranches. There's 600 people in the whole county, right? So if you were to focus on the protective service of the barrier islands, right, from storm surge, that's really not demanded there because there's no infrastructure behind it. Yet the potential is always there, right? So ecosystem services potential always exists, but it does have to be demanded. And one of the things that to think about is it implicit demand that's required, or does it have to be explicit demand? We're not going to answer that today, but you know, think about that. But I think one of the things you bring up is quality differences, and yes, absolutely, that's an issue. One of the examples I was thinking about putting in fragmented marsh versus continuous marsh, and they provide very different services. Well, they function very differently, and so they provide very different services. The fragmented marsh is, you know, the quality of the fishing you expect to be great here, but I didn't. As I think about marsh, right? So you have lots of edge, able to get back into the lakes, etc. But the protective service, not as much. Whereas you have the continuous marsh, right? Protective service of high quality, but recreational fishing service, not as much. So you do have to take into account the quality of the service, absolutely. And so yes, we do that. Yeah. Okay. Lee, yeah.
So when they had the requirements for the Corps to include it in their evaluations and then they took it out, what sort of foundation was there for them to incorporate ecosystem services into their evaluations? Or was that something they were going to have to develop?
So you mean like capacity within the Corps?
Yeah.
How many people have dealt with the Corps? Right, so do I need to answer the question? So there was.
I mean, were you trying to put things in place, or is there something that you were hoping that they would have to develop some criteria that would be widely used?
Yes. So the guidelines came out of the White House, so they just needed to follow those guidelines, but they needed they needed to have internal processes. There is recognition of ecosystem services. We've worked with people from the Corps, but the capacity to actually do that and the power is really in the districts, right? And so to get that capacity and that understanding in the districts was very limited. And like all federal agencies, I mean, for the Corps, it's just really hard for them to turn that battleship or that aircraft carrier very quickly. And I don't think it's not that they don't want to do that. It's just they're, you know, by nature very conservative. And so it's going to take probably a little bit more time. But there is that recognition. They are building capacity. They have contracted with individuals to help them begin to understand this outside of the Corps. So it is happening. I hope that answers your question. Yeah. Well, so that's interesting. So the principles and guidelines requirements are just for federally funded water projects. So if you're going to dredge, you know, if it's Corps money, it's a federally funded water project, so it has to include that. So that would be exempt at this point from including ecosystem services. Now, the memo that's come out from the White House says, okay, but everything else that you're doing has to, if it's appropriate, has to begin to include ecosystem services. And it's not always the valuation, the monetary valuation. It may just be enough to identify those ecosystem services or quantify them in some non-monetary value. Yes?
So when you're deciding on what per scenarios for the per person increase in pay to what it needs to pay, did you incorporate the actual average cost of restoration projects being involved? Because the minimum isn't enough to do any restoration. Did you include that in?
Oh, so the information that we would give to the survey respondents. So the question is, did we include the potential cost of restoration in the information?
I'm sure everybody would be willing to pay $1. include that into the survey at all?
Right, no, so that was not included in the survey, and the reason being, that's a very good question. So the reason being is that we were really trying to assess the benefits that we see from, that they perceive coming from these natural habitats, biophysical features, and we didn't want them to get hung up on the cost side, like if they felt, oh, it's too overwhelming. So if we're trying to restore, the Gulf Coast, Alabama, just only Alabama, hundreds of millions of dollars, that would turn somebody off right away. And we didn't want to do that. We want to say, okay, based on all this information, regardless of cost, what's important to you and how much would you be willing to separate yourself from your hard-earned cash?
And then secondly, did you
Follow-up question. Yes.
Did you try to incorporate people's, not education, but knowledge about the potential value into that?
Oh yeah. That's all. And I didn't. I could have shared many more of the descriptive statistics, but yeah, education, income levels, awareness of. Well, so as you would expect, those that had a stronger connection, either knowledge or they actually did something in the natural environment, were willing to pay more than those that didn't. Yeah. Other questions? Yes.
One of the things I was curious about is as we're in the midst of seeing a lot of systems that are changing over, so marsh habitat becoming mangrove habitat,
Yep.
as climate change happens, sea level rise, and all those factors kind of get rolling. How efficient is it going to be to kind of work that data up the chain to get policy and then work it back down before it say becomes, I don't want to say ineffective, but we have more research that's going to ultimately change it again?
So did you say efficient?
I would say just
how does that happen?
We can move back up and then move.
Yeah, no, that's the challenge, and that's why I was saying, we need to be able to communicate it. So we're all doing good work here, but if it's not getting into the hands of the policymakers, the Restore Council, those within NOAA that have control in certain programs over dollars that we might be accessing, that influence is really important. And quite honestly, I knew that to be the case before I went to DC and was at NOAA. Now I really know the case. That's a fact. We need to take advantage of all those opportunities. And so that's why I was saying, if you hear Compass calling, take advantage of those opportunities to be able to do the science communication workshops, because it would really be beneficial for you in the long run. So to your question, I'm hoping there's people listening, but if you're not feeding the pipeline with your information, and they're not going out and looking for the peer-reviewed literature. They don't have time. Staff doesn't have time to do that, and the policymakers definitely don't have time. So you got to feed them that information in other ways. Other questions, comments?
Do you have any more questions?
Well, we timed that just about right.